So good morning, everyone, and welcome to Grand Rounds. I'm going to start us with our land acknowledgement. The San Francisco Health Commission acknowledges that we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land, and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place, as well as for all peoples who reside in their traditional territory. As guests, we recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush Ohlone community and affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. So this is our second of 6+ Grand Rounds. And again, we are aiming to think beyond the traditional healthcare systems, how the traditional healthcare systems define our roles, and to embrace emerging ideas to help mitigate inequities that we see today. And so today we'll hear from Dr. Zaya Malawa on taking action to dismantle anti-Black racism. Dr. Malawa is a mother, pediatrician, and public health professional committed to improving health outcomes for children of color. To achieve this dream, she holds a lot of jobs. Currently, Dr. Malawa is the director of Expecting Justice, a public health program that strives to dismantle racism and close the racial gap in birth outcomes. In this capacity, she directs the Abundant Birth Project. She is also the Perinatal Equity Medical Director at the San Francisco Department of Public Health and adjunct faculty at the UC Berkeley School of Public Health. She has a course there, check it out. She chairs the SF First Five Commission and parents a couple of kids and a traumatized dog in her free time. Having clearly mastered the art of work-life balance, she hopes to have a couple more jobs by the end of the year. And Dr. Malawa, we are, of course, happy that one of those jobs is working with us here at 6M since January. Thank you so much for being here today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled to be talking to y'all about something that is so passionate for me. And just also apologies to anybody who is coming to hear Justice next week, because I'm going to be giving the same talk. But I had this kid in my medical school who used to say, he was Russian, and in a Russian accent, he would say, repetition is the mother of learning. And I believe that. So hopefully it will end up feeling beneficial. Okay, what happened now? Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yay. Okay, great. So let's see. The approach I'm going to take here is I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about anti-racist praxis. This idea of praxis, actually in terms of liberatory movements, came from a man named Paulo Freire, who's from Brazil. And in the 1970s, he wrote a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He put forth a number of really important ideas around liberation in that book, but one of the things he talked about was this idea of praxis. And what praxis is basically the unification of action with reflection and theory. And this is in response to something that often happens in liberatory movements where either people are focused on action but haven't done some of the reflection work, and so their actions aren't having the impact that they hope to have, or people are kind of more armchairing things in the more reflection or theoretical space, but those never have the impact because there's no action associated with it. And so what praxis looks like is how we integrate all of these components to maximize the impact of our liberation efforts. So I'm going to start with reflection. And in the name of reflection, I think it's really important that we think first about history, because most of us have been taught history in a very limited and biased way. And as a result, it can be confusing to understand some of the racialized dynamics that we see in present day. So as a reminder, slavery existed in this country towards primarily Black people for about 2.5 centuries. And during that time, it's estimated that about $17.5 trillion worth of wealth was extracted from the Black population through the form of chattel slavery. And then, a lot of people oftentimes might think, well, slavery happened before my ancestors came to this country, or slavery happened a long time ago, so it probably shouldn't have very much bearing on today's world. But it's important to recognize that as much as we like to talk about American ingenuity in this country, a lot of the origins of this country's global dominance, this country's positioning as a world superpower, actually came from the monetary advantage that this country had through both the theft of indigenous land, but also the brutal extraction of free labor from the African descendants that are enslaved in the country. And so the economic advantages that we enjoy in this country, they came at a price that we haven't yet repaid. And so even if your family was not here during slavery times, if you are benefiting from the economic advantages of this country, then you, like all of us collectively, owe a debt to Black and Indigenous folks who made that possible. I want to remind people also that it was not just a cost in terms of extraction of wealth, but also extraction of humanity. And in particular for Black women, we were often medicalized during this period of time. Our bodies were pathologized, our tendencies to want to escape slavery were pathologized. And then also, many people are familiar with Marion Sims, who is often designated as the father of obstetrics. But what's really important to recognize is that a lot of the surgical techniques that Marion Sims was pioneered on unanesthetized Black slaves without their consent. And so there was this way in which, one of the costs of slavery was dehumanization of all Black people, but in particular, there was a way that Black women and Black birthing people, were dehumanized. Unless we think that we're so far removed from this history, it's really important to recognize how the ideologies that were formed during slavery time continue to impact our thinking in this country in present day. What you can see here, this image, this graphic, is basically showing some of the results from a study in 2016 that was on medical learners, so basically medical students and residents, to really understand what racialized health beliefs they might have. And as you can see, a lot of medical learners have some pretty problematic beliefs based on race. For instance, you can see that a significant proportion of learners thought that Black people's blood coagulates more quickly than white people's, that Black nerve endings are somehow less sensitive than white nerve endings, or that Blacks have thicker skin. In fact, a majority of the medical learners in this study thought that Blacks have thicker skin than white people. Just in case this needs to be said, I want to let everyone know that race is not a biological construct. And so there are no consistent physiologic differences that we can identify based on race. But nevertheless, many people can get through a significant proportion of their medical training still believing these highly problematic racialized views. So you can see why Black people are much more likely to get poorer care. Okay, and so, of course, when slavery ended, it wasn't like folks, especially former slave owners in this country, took that change well. And so what we started to see in the wake of the ending of slavery in this country is terrorism, often by white landowners, as a way to keep the Black population, quote unquote, in line, but mainly to keep the Black population available for exploitation and cheap labor. Ida B. Wells is an important journalist that I think doesn't get enough credit because she was such a brave Black woman who at that time, she was writing about the terroristic nature of lynching in this country. I don't know how else to say it. And she was really pointing out that although lynching was often kind of promoted as a method of law and order, what it really was is it was disproportionately impacting economically successful Black people. And so it was really being used as a form of social control. And so these are the kinds of things that a Black person might have gotten lynched for in the mid-1800s through the mid-1900s, things like quarreling, arguing with the white man, demanding respect, acting suspiciously. I would make the argument that these are the same things that a lot of times Black people are currently getting lynched by police for. But I also want to point out the image that I included on this. And what you can see basically is this is an image of white people at a lynching in the 1950s in this country. And I think it's important to see this because so often when lynching is represented like in the movies, what we see are a bunch of people who are hiding their faces behind hoods and they're coming out at night and doing this dastardly deed in secret. But in reality, lynching was often like a family event in this country. It often happened as a picnic after church on a Sunday. It was often something that people would bring their kids to. And this is crazy to me, but people would often take mementos, pieces of the desecrated body with them as a keepsake of the day that they had. And I mention all of this to just again point out how thoroughly dehumanized Black people are in not that distant history. It's really important to recognize that there was a time in this country where this kind of behavior was totally normalized, and treating Black people in a way that most of us wouldn't even treat animals was a completely regular way to be. We haven't done a whole lot of healing in this country to recover from this mindset or this ideology. And as a result, we see persistent racism popping up in any number of ways. Okay, and then terrorism, of course, wasn't just happening on an individual level, but it was also happening to a certain extent on a policy level. One example of this is redlining. Redlining was a process that developed in the wake of the Great Depression, where basically banks would determine where would be a safe place to make a home loan and where would be a quote unquote risky place to make a home loan. And if your neighborhood was designated as risky, it would be marked with red lines, hence the name redlining. But generally, what determined whether or not a neighborhood was safe or risky was really the percentage of people of color, immigrants, and mainly, frankly, Black people. And so what ended up happening is that, home loans that were in areas that were redlined were not insured by the federal government, making these home loans much more expensive and making the property values in those neighborhoods decrease. And so as a result, a number of white people in the wake of World War II were returning with their GI benefits to buy homes in the suburbs, and these homes gained a lot of value over the preceding 3 decades, whereas Black people were not able to participate in the same housing market because of redlining, and as a result, they were excluded from a lot of these wealth generating opportunities. Another form of policy terrorism that we saw in this country is called urban renewal. And I'm going to try to describe urban renewal in a few key steps. And so step 1 is that you have to make investment in Black communities nearly impossible. And so redlining did that very effectively. Like when there are maps of cities where a certain area is literally circled in red and designated as hazardous or risky, not surprisingly, a lot of businesses, a lot of employers are not going to be flooding that neighborhood trying to make investments. And not surprisingly, a lot of folks in that neighborhood are not going to be able to get high quality loans for improvements, capital investments, et cetera. So then the second step in destroying Black livelihood through urban renewal is that, high level officials have to promote a narrative that poor people are a threat to cities and therefore something needs to be done. A lot of people don't realize this, but President Eisenhower was a notorious racist. And one of the things that he was constantly talking about was the pressing problem of quote unquote urban blight, which was coded speech a lot of times for the high concentration of folks of color living in cities now that white flight had driven so many white people into the suburbs. And he often talked about urban blight as if it were a disease that's catching, but it was often coded racialized speech for talking about what he felt was the threatening presence of so many folks of color in our cities. Okay, and then step 3, what you do is you create a financial incentive for governments to displace Black families. And so what ended up happening is that the federal government made a number of block grants available to states and local governments to address urban blight. And basically what you had to do as a city is you had to designate that a certain area was quote unquote blighted. And if you did that, then you would get this money that would allow you to clear the area of the quote unquote blight and then redevelop it. And so the ways that local and state governments would decide whether or not an area was blighted was often based on the average income of the residents, but also the racialization of the neighborhoods. And so 2/3 of the neighborhoods that were destroyed through the urban renewal funding in this country were Black. And a significant number of the burgeoning Latinx communities in this country were also destroyed through this process of urban renewal. Okay, so then step 4. Now you have this money from the government, you use eminent domain to displace a bunch of marginalized people, but get their land at bargain prices. And so a lot of Black people had to try to fight these eminent domain cases, and a lot of the eminent domain case law that is used even still today was established during this highly racialized process of urban renewal. And so as a result, a number of Black people who had figured out, despite the fact that they weren't getting guaranteed loans from the bank, had figured out how to become homeowners. And then just as they were starting to accumulate wealth from being a homeowner, they were displaced. Their property was bought at undervalue through the eminent domain process. And then, of course, step 5 in this process for a government is now that they've demolished all the homes, they can sell this land to private developers at a profit. And the developers can build something that is more acceptable to the white residents of the city. These pictures that you're seeing are basically pictures, of San Francisco's urban renewal process. And so what you can see on the left there is basically the area, which is basically the Fillmore, that was designated for urban renewal. They destroyed a bunch of Victorians and they replaced it with some of the things that we see there now, mainly the expanded Geary Boulevard and also the Japantown Center. Talk about a racial wedge, right? Urban renewal, many people didn't realize, but in the 1940s in San Francisco, the Fillmore district was a thriving Black community. And it had so much Black wealth and Black culture that it became dubbed the Harlem of the West. And San Francisco was like a stop that any of the important jazz performers couldn't miss if they were going to be anywhere on the western side of the country, because our Black community was so well known for its rich cultural life. And then urban renewal happened. And by the numbers, what you can see is that 60 blocks in the Fillmore were demolished. Around 900 businesses were shut down. Nearly 5,000 households were forced out, mostly Black. 2,500 Victorian homes were demolished, and $50 million were spent on the project. And I think it's important to recognize that the Fillmore was Black not by accident. Part of the reason why the Fillmore was one of the Black neighborhoods in San Francisco was because Japanese people had been displaced and put into internment camps. And previously the Fillmore had been a predominantly Japanese neighborhood. And so all of a sudden, many white landlords had a bunch of open space. And so Black folks moved in to fill the gap for landlords. And then, after World War II, when this country started to come and reckon with how terrible the internment process was, as a way to make amends, they used this urban renewal process to displace Black Americans and establish the Japantown Center. And while I think it is so important that we make reparations and amends to Japanese people, I think it's notable that they did it on the backs of Black people, creating inevitably a lot of racial tension between those two communities as they're now kind of fighting for space. San Francisco is a huge city. There are so many other ways that we could have done this that honored both communities, but instead we did it this way, and we still deal with the legacy of that. Okay, so how are we doing now? Well, when Black people in San Francisco were displaced through urban renewal, they were given these certificates that were called certificates of preference. And what it was meant to mean is that, if you got one of these certificates, then you would have first priority to move back in when they rebuild this blighted area. But what ended up happening was that they destroyed all of the homes, and then they waited 10, 15, 20 years to start doing the rebuilding. And as a result, many Black families and many Black businesses had to go elsewhere. And as a result of that, approximately only 6% of the businesses in Fillmore are now Black owned. And honestly, I put this slide together a few years ago, pre-pandemic, so I imagine that number is even smaller now. How are we doing as a nation? Well, one thing I want to point out, of course, is that we're struggling with mass incarceration of Black people in this country. On the left, you can see that Black people and white people tend to use drugs at more or less the same rates. You can see that maybe Black people like marijuana a little bit more, maybe white people enjoy cocaine and hallucinogens a little bit more, but overall, it's like pretty similar rates. Nevertheless, you can see that there are huge disparities in terms of who gets incarcerated and who gets arrested for drug offenses. And so as a result, we have a pretty significant mass incarceration problem today. People often will say, well, if people could just go to college and get an education, that would probably fix things for folks of color. But I just want to point out that college is not a cure for the longstanding wealth gaps that we have seen develop over time. In fact, a Black woman who has a college degree is probably has less wealth than a white person with a college degree, and probably the same is true for a Latina woman. How about Black people and hiring? I think a lot of times we look at Black poverty, but we don't know why we see that. So it's important to see these kinds of studies that have been done. And so on the left, what you can see is these kinds of studies where they send out two identical resumes. The resumes are the same in every way except the names. One name on the resume is going to be racialized to sound white, and one name is going to sound black to most ears. And then they send out these resumes and they see what callbacks do these people get from the resumes. And what you can see on the left here is that if you're Black, it doesn't matter if you send out a high quality resume or a low quality resume, you're probably not going to get a call back. And then what you can see on the right is that, a Black man without a criminal record on his resume is less likely to get a call back than a white man with a criminal record. And a Black person with a criminal record, which we have a disproportionate number of because of mass incarceration, stands only a 5% chance of getting a call back, making it really, really difficult for somebody who's been caught up in the incarceration system to come out and participate in the legal economy. And so what we can see by race is that, there were huge disparities in terms of who's been allowed to accumulate wealth in this country and who has not. So for instance, you can see that Latina families and Black families are earning significantly less wealth than white families and Asian families on average. Now, of course, within these racial categories, there's a lot of nuance, which I need to mention. But when we look at the category of race, and that's what we're talking about today is racialized wealth disparities, this is what we see. We have racially biased policing in San Francisco, despite our progressive intentions. The New York Times found in 2016 that despite Black people making up less than 6% of the population at that time, they made up 15% of all of the traffic stops in the city, and they accounted for 42% of all of the no consent searches. But notably, these searches were not driven by the fact that the cops were frequently finding illegal things on the Black people that they were searching. In fact, Black people were the least likely to actually have something illegal on them when they were searched without their consent. San Francisco is failing our Black students. We have the dubious outcome in this city of having the worst Black student outcomes for several years running now in all of California, which is confusing to me given how large of a budget we have in San Francisco and how few Black kindergartners we enroll into SFUSD each year. But despite that, we tend to have worse outcomes for our Black students than any other school district in the entire state. And we also tend to have really high Black unemployment. The Brookings Institute did a study in 2017 of cities across the country and their rates of unemployment by race. And what they found is that San Francisco had the second highest rate of Black unemployment in the entire country. The first highest was Detroit. But obviously San Francisco and Detroit are very, very different places. And one of the biggest differences is that San Francisco had the fourth lowest white unemployment rate in the country, unlike Detroit that had a very high white unemployment rate also. And this is largely driven by anti-Black racism in San Francisco that excludes in particular Black folks from some of our highest quality jobs in the city. And I want you to think about for a second, like, when was the last time that you saw a Black man in your workplace that wasn't working as security or as one of the medical learners? Like, genuinely, when was the last time that any of y'all saw that? And so this is what Black folks are dealing with in San Francisco when it comes time to get high quality employment. What about median income in San Francisco? As you can see, this is also very racialized for the same reasons that we just discussed. But San Francisco is a very expensive place to live. And so according to the family needs calculator, you need around $60,000 a year to be a single adult in San Francisco. You need around 120 to be a single adult with a single kid in San Francisco. And if you are a two-parent, two-kid household, you need over $160,000 a year to make all the ends meet, according to the family needs calculator. And that was in 2021. So I didn't even update this for the most recent year. As you can see, many of our families of color are not earning nearly enough money to make the ends meet in this city, but in particular, Black people are at such a huge deficit from where they would need to be in order to make sure that they have what they need to make sure their kids are healthy and safe. And so put another way, we need to see that in San Francisco, 48% of Black children live below the 100% federal poverty line. And that's compared to only 2% of white children in the city. And then one area where I spend a lot of my energy is around birth outcomes and disparities in birth outcomes. And so there's a study that is done each year called MIHA, Maternal and Infant Health Indicator Study. And what they found in 2018 by survey is that nearly a quarter of the Black pregnant people in the city didn't have a place to sleep during their pregnancy. And that's compared to just under 3% as the city average. What you can see here is a comparison between the redlining map and the preterm birth map in San Francisco. And you can see that you can almost superimpose these two maps because despite the fact that redlining ended decades ago, the impact, the ramifications of that policy continue to touch us today. So I hope I made the case that we have some work to do, even in a city as progressive as San Francisco. But I hate the kind of lectures where they talk about how terrible racism is and then they kind of leave it there. So what I want to offer now is kind of what do we do about it? So we're going to move into the theory portion of praxis. And what I want to offer you is the racism as a root cause approach. Which is an approach that a framework that I tried to create to help people start to think about in a deep way, like how can we actually start to dismantle racism through our interventions. And so what I created basically are 4 criteria that you should try and include in any intervention you're doing to address disparities so that you're actually trying to get at the racism at the root of the disparity. So I'm going to talk my way through each of these criteria. Okay, so the first criteria that we need to include in our interventions if we're going to be anti-racist is that our interventions need to be long-term. Racism has been around for a very, very long time, around 4 centuries in this country. And so it's silly to think that an intervention that is going to last for, maybe a few months or even a few years is going to have a significant impact on such a long-standing system. So if we want to be addressing racism as a root cause of health disparities, we need to plan for the long term with our interventions. What that usually looks like to me is finding a way to connect it to government funding or some kind of other institutionalized funding, which means usually policy work. If we're trying to do a brand new intervention that no one's ever seen before, it's rare that you're going to connect to instantaneous long-term funding. But I guess what I would offer in that situation is that whenever you pilot something to address racial disparities, you need to be planning in that same moment that you're planning the pilot, the pathway for sustainability. That's what it looks like, I think, to show up respectfully in our communities and to be thinking authentically about anti-racism. Okay, the next criteria is that we need to be willing to have a precise impact on the racially marginalized groups at hand. And I think that that's something that most of us are really uncomfortable with. We like to talk about low-income people or people of color as shorthand, but the problem is that when we look at people of color, not all people of color experience racism the same way. For instance, the kind of racism that a Native American person faces who's been living maybe on a reservation for generations is going to look very different than the kind of racism that a recently immigrated Vietnamese person might be facing in California. And if we have a single approach for both of those groups, then we're probably not going to be meeting either of those people's needs. And so when we're addressing racism as a root cause, we need to be willing to get precise and understand exactly how racism is creating barriers in a given community, and then be willing to address those barriers in a precise way. When we look at things like, I don't know, like take Obamacare, for instance, it hasn't been able to have much of an impact on racial health disparities, even though it's a really wonderful intervention. Part of the reason why is because, for instance, if you look at why Black people are not going to the doctor, lack of insurance might be part of it, but part of it is the kind of care that most of us get when we come to the doctor. And so if we don't have a precise impact, if we try to have this kind of universal approach, then we may not be getting at what's actually wrong. And so therefore, we're not going to be having the impact that we want to have. So if we're addressing racism as a root cause, we need to be willing to get precise. Many of us work with multiple groups, like we're not just working in a single racialized group. And when that happens, what we need to do is we need to be able to nuance our intervention so that for each group that we're working with, there's something that meets them where they're at. And the last thing I want to mention about precise impact is that the best way to get precise is to go to the experts. People who are experiencing racism every day in their community are going to be the best able to tell you how racism is manifesting in their community. So when we're having a precise impact, we need to pay community for their expertise. Okay, the next criteria is around systems change. And this is a call for us to move away from trying to change people trying to make people more educated, more resilient in the face of racist systems. And rather, what if we turn our attention to the environments around our patients and trying to make those less problematic and less racist? And so when we're doing racism as a root cause interventions, we need to be really focusing on policies, on systems, and on environments, as opposed to changing people. Because as a reminder, there's not actually anything wrong with us Black people. What's wrong is the environment in which we're trying to live and be healthy. And then, the last criteria, of course, is reparations. And I think this is important to recognize because I think a lot of us want to believe that just with time, all of these old racial injuries are going to go away. But I hope what I made the case for you today is that, we have been extracting wealth from Black people and frankly, many communities of color for centuries. And that injury doesn't just go away. We need to take corrective action to repair what has been broken if we actually want to see a narrowing of these health disparities. And so when I'm calling for reparations, I'm calling for that kind of corrective action. I recognize that most of us are not in a position to be handing out dollars to our clients or to be able to provide 40 acres and a mule, although I'm here for that. But if you're not, then what you can do instead is keep your eyes on three things: the resources, the opportunities, and the power associated with your intervention, and be constantly trying to think about, how do I shift those into the communities that I'm trying to address racism within? And so let me talk to you about what usually happens in your institution and mine and large institutions all over the country. Maybe a new funding opportunity pops up. And what's probably going to happen is that there's going to be a hard deadline on this, and people are going to be running behind, and people are going to be pressed. And so chances are folks from the institution are going to submit the proposal without much consult from community because of their sense of urgency. And with that decision, already the white-led institution has now hoarded all of the decision-making power within itself and excluded any decision-making power from the community that's experiencing racism. And then usually probably what's going to happen is that, we get this funding and now we need to hire folks to do this new work. But because of the ways that our institutions are structured, there is a ton of paperwork and tests and civil servant laws, et cetera, that make it really hard to enter our institutions. And so unless you already have a connection, you probably are not going to get hired into these jobs. And so now we've probably hoarded the majority of the opportunities associated with this new funding within the white-led institution. And then what's going to happen is that we have to, pay the people that we hired, and these institutions tend to have, really high indirect fees, really high fringe benefits rates, restrictions on who we can contract with. So chances are we can only, hire caterers that are also from white-led institutions, or only hire graphic designers from white-led institutions. And so when it's all said and done, chances are that the institution has hoarded most of the resources within itself instead of sharing those out with community. And all community got from this funding opportunity probably are some services that they never even asked for, provided by people that are not from their community. This is what your institution, mine, Berkeley, we all do this all the time. And so what racism as a root cause is asking us to do is to really think about, how can we authentically shift decision-making power into communities experiencing racism? How can we provide as many opportunities to build people's career for them to have their voices at the table through this funding opportunity? How can we make sure that as many resources as possible end up in the pockets of folks in this community where we're trying to address racism? When we do that, that's a way that we can be trying to integrate the principle of reparations into our intervention. So when we put all four of these criteria together, we get the racism as a root cause approach. We shorten it to RRC because we feel like if it has an acronym, then it's like a real thing in medicine. And we know that, trying to get all four criteria into a single intervention might be hard. So what does it look like to try for 2 or maybe 3? Maybe you already have an existing intervention. How can you integrate some of these components into your existing intervention so that it has more of an anti-racist impact? We've also used this framework for outcomes evaluations on our different projects, for budget planning and strategic planning with different organizations. And I think another organization used it for a grant RFP. We got it published because we recognize that when we're operating in white-led institutions, a lot of times having the reification of publication makes some of these ideas go down better. And so it was published in the Journal of Pediatrics. And so feel free to pull it up if you're trying to make a case to your boss, and they would be more compelled by something from the Journal of Pediatrics. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is the action component of praxis. So what might this look like in practice? Okay, first I'm going to tell you about what this does not look like in practice. So in 2017, the Department of Public Health the California Department of Public Health put out this flyer for Black women to help us understand what we need to know to reduce our risks of preterm birth. I hate this flyer. It really focuses on individual behaviors. So just to go into detail, it tells us Black women that we should take a daily vitamin, we need to go to the doctor, we should not smoke, we should eat healthy and exercise, and we should definitely make sure everyone's helping us because, having a baby is tough. Nah, I hate this flyer. So what is so terrible about this flyer? So one thing is that it doesn't acknowledge in any way that racism is really the driver of these disparities in preterm birth. And the research is pretty clear on this at that point. And so by not mentioning this, it kind of leaves it for Black women to wonder, well, is the problem us? It also focuses on these individual behaviors instead of recognizing these barriers that Black women are systematically facing when they're trying to have good health during pregnancy. Okay, so what was the impact of this flyer? I don't think we can blame this entirely on the flyer, but as a reminder, the flyer came out in 2017, and what you can see here, that red line is the preterm birth rate for Black birthing people in San Francisco, and then all those other colors are basically everybody else. And so you can see the flyer came out, and then the preterm birth rate increased, and the disparity widened, and but I don't think that's all their fault, but it didn't obviously have a huge positive impact. And I'll say that there were no Black women involved in the creation of that flyer. Okay, so is it an RRC? Okay, so health interventions like health education interventions that are flyer oriented, are short term, they're not long term, and they're not going to do anything to address longstanding systemic barriers. So it is not long term. Does it have a precise impact? I would tend to think no. I can't imagine that there is a group of pregnant people who should smoke or should not take a vitamin. And so there's nothing kind of precise about this advice. But I think more to the point, it fails to acknowledge the very specific barriers of anti-Blackness that Black birthing people are facing when trying to be pregnant. Systems change? Absolutely not. This is focused only on what individuals can be doing differently, and reparations, also none. Like they didn't even, engage community members, Black community members, to help design the flyer. Okay, so what's an alternative? So I'm going to present my project here, which is the Abundant Birth Project. The Abundant Birth Project is a guaranteed income program. It provides a monthly stipend of $1,000 during pregnancy. It's the first of its kind in the United States, and we piloted it with 151 Black and Pacific Islander pregnant people in San Francisco, because those are the two groups that are most likely to have adverse birth outcomes in our city. We started enrollment on Juneteenth of 2021, and we actually completed it in June of 2022. We were really intentional about our design process. And so our very first step when we got our first grant was to hire 4 mamas who identify as either Black and or Pacific Islander and are interested in birth work. We trained them in qualitative methods, and they in turn went out and did a couple of dozen qualitative interviews with other Black and PI mamas to find out what people would want to see from a guaranteed income program for pregnant people. After we got that data from those interviews, we collectively analyzed it together as a team. And then we actually went on to have, I know it says 2 human-centered designs, but it was really 2.5, because we also got some kind of usability testing, feedback design thinking. And design thinking was a wonderful tool to use because it allowed us to really hand over the big decisions to community, like, what do you guys want to do with this money if somebody becomes incarcerated while they're pregnant? What should we do if somebody experiences, a fetal loss? And so being able to partner very authentically and actually hand the keys over to community felt really reassuring as we were going through the design process. We continue to use our community researchers now, even after the program launched, to do the evaluation. And we have participating in the research for our participants was completely optional, but we had an 80% opt-in rate. One of the things we learned during our formative research is that a lot of Black people in San Francisco, when they think about research, they think of old white men in white coats. And so what we did when we invited people for research is we created these Instagram flyers with our community researchers so that people would know who they'd be talking to if they opted into our research. And we think it made a huge difference. Once we launched, we built a community governance council which is made up of about half Black and or PI mamas from San Francisco and half other stakeholders across San Francisco that care a lot about birth. So different department leads, people from the health insurance company, obviously people from the hospitals, et cetera. And what we would do is bring all of our decision making as things came up in the project to this group to make sure that community continued to have an authentic voice. What we learned is that when you're bringing mamas from the community into the same room as department heads, there's a very significant power imbalance that might sometimes impede conversation. And so we brought in certain techniques to make sure that we centered mamas' voices in the shared decision-making space. One of the things that we did is what we call the expert opinion practice. What this is that before we take any major vote, we take a pause and mamas are allowed to share their opinion on how they think we should vote, and nobody is allowed to rebut them. And so that took off some of the pressure from the mamas from feeling like they needed to argue with like the head of Medi-Cal over their opinion by allowing them this kind of space to be able to say what they think. And then the other thing that we do is we do weighted votes for mamas. And so sometimes when we're taking a vote on a critical item, then we'll ask, you know, as the last thing in what we're having people vote on, do you identify as a Black or Pacific Islander mama? And if you say yes, then we're going to count your vote for more than other people's as a way to continue to center community voice. So briefly, after all of this formative work, this was the eligibility of our program. You had to be under 6 months pregnant and planning to parent. You had to be Black and or Pacific Islander identified because those are the groups that had the highest rates of disparities. And you had to be from San Francisco. Community felt like it was really important that we include not just the lowest income families, but also some of those middle income families given the cost of living. So the income cutoff was $100,000. And this was an unconditional cash transfer. So people did not have to do anything to get the money. We wanted to make sure that people didn't feel stigmatized by our program, because one of the other things we learned about in research is that some of our existing public benefits programs can feel very stigmatizing to participate in, especially for Black people. And so we hired local artists from Black and Pacific Islander communities to create some of the outreach flyers and make sure that we were communicating the sense of dignity and cultural pride through our outreach materials. Okay, so is it an RRC? So is it long-term? We're hoping so. We're working really hard to get there. So SB 65, which is the bill I'll talk about in one quick second, offers medium-term sustainability. It offers some public funding for medium-term sustainability. And then we're really looking at things like refundable tax credits or maybe some of the federal block grants that are going for pregnancy services exist currently to be our long-term sustainability plan. But the first step is we need to gather the data. Does it have a precise impact? We think so. We focused in on Black and Pacific Islander people specifically because they have the greatest risk of adverse birth outcomes. And we did work with those two groups separately at times to make sure that we had things for Pacific Islander people and things for Black people. You can see that, for instance, in our outreach materials. Systems change. We think so, because even though we're giving cash to individuals, we're not actually asking individuals to change. What we're trying to do is to make the economic environment around these individuals a little bit softer and a little bit gentler. So we think of this as systems change. And reparations, absolutely. We worked really, really hard to make sure that we shifted the power, the resources, and the opportunities into the community to the extent possible. Okay, here's my last example. SB 65, the California Momnibus Act. So this got passed in 2021 after about 4 years of effort. And I guess I will say 2 years of effort on the backside also. We're still working through the implementation of this. But the California Momnibus Bill, one of the things it does is it removes the work requirement for pregnant people who are on welfare. And so prior to this bill, you basically until you could go on maternity leave from your doctor, you had to be either working or looking for work if you were receiving welfare. And now you don't have to work until your baby is 2.5 years old if you're on welfare. It also extends pregnancy Medi-Cal through 12 months postpartum permanently. That was a temporary measure that got put in place with COVID, but this bill makes it permanent in California. It provides full spectrum doula care covered through Medi-Cal, which has been huge. And so we are working on implementing this, so stand by. And hopefully in about 4 months, I can give you a list of Black and Latina doulas that accept Medi-Cal in San Francisco if you have clients that need that. And then lastly, it provides $25 million for pregnancy guaranteed income pilots in the state of California. And so the great news is that Expecting Justice, the group that we run, was able to get 5 million of that 25 million. So in the fall, we'll be relaunching the Abundant Birth Project, and we'll be in Alameda, Contra Costa, Riverside, and LA County, in addition to hopefully San Francisco County. So that's very exciting. Is it an RRC? So is it long-term? Yes, when SB 65 passed, sorry, this is past tense, but when it passed, this is policy now. And so this to us is the gold standard of a long-term intervention. Precise impact, we're giving that a little check mark because what I have learned in a very intense way in the last 3 years is that it's tricky to do racially specific repair work with public dollars. And so to the extent possible, we really tried to make sure that some of the bill was really focused on communities experiencing disparities. Systems change, absolutely. There's not one single thing in this bill that requires individuals to do something new. And reparations, we think so, because marginalized birthing people are the ones who stand the most to gain in terms of resources, opportunity, and power through this bill. Okay, so in closing, I just wanted to recognize that not all of us are in positions to be launching large-scale initiatives or leading state legislation, but that doesn't mean that you can't be uprooting racism in your own garden as we speak. So as an individual, you can make a long-term commitment to anti-racism. So often we want to go to one workshop here and there and check the anti-racism box, but that's not actually how this works. We have to pledge ourselves to lifelong learning and unlearning, but also we have to pledge ourselves to lifelong doing and undoing if we want to actually see anti-racist change. Precise impact. What this might look like is focusing at least some of your liberatory efforts on the most marginalized. This is really important because, as a reminder, until all of us are experiencing liberation, then none of us are free from oppression. And so if you're working really hard in your community, but there are other folks who are still experiencing marginalization, then we're not going to actually have the collective liberation that we all deserve. And so we need to focus at least some of our attention on the folks who are experiencing the greatest amount of marginalization. We need to be thinking about systems change. So one way to do that is to really keep systems at the center of what we're doing. And so ask systems level questions in your research. Consider structural factors and structural barriers when you're working with patients. Push back on these narratives that blame individuals for racialized health disparities, because we know that that's a systems issue. And then also, unfortunately, you're going to have to get political in your free time, because it can be often difficult to get political when you're paid by the government. And so you, in your free time, need to think about voting rights and voting yourself. You need to call your politician. I can't tell you how impactful local politicians find it when people take the time to call, or better yet, set up an appointment to testify about a need that they see in the community. As doctors in particular, we have a lot of political weight that often goes untapped. And so you should please use it on behalf of our clients who are experiencing racial marginalization. And then, of course, partner with groups that are already doing the work. And that, lastly, reparations. How can we do this as individuals? Well, we can share our power. What does it look like to invite community members to participate in decision-making? Do you sit at a decision-making table? How can you advocate to bring some community voice to that table? We can share our opportunities. Every single one of us can be mentoring Black and Indigenous students who are deeply, deeply underrepresented in medicine. It's really difficult, I can say, as a Black person who went into medicine, to find your way, because most of us don't actually have family members who can help us figure out how to do this. And so mentorship is so, so important if we want to see more diversity in the upper ranks of medicine. And then lastly, we can share our resources. I mean, I know that as pediatricians, we are not exactly bringing in the big bucks, but nevertheless, we are making a lot more money than, for instance, the typical Black family in San Francisco. And so what does it look like to actually donate our time to make sure that when community members are stepping in, they're getting paid, right? What does it look like to make sure that we're compensating people for their emotional labor? What does it look like for us to make sure that when we're extracting information from our community, that we're putting something back? So that's what I got for y'all. If you have questions, I'm so happy to take them, but otherwise, thank you for your kind attention.
Saya, thank you. Thank you so much. You gave us a history lesson. You gave us some numbers. You gave us a framework. You gave us a program as an example, and you gave us some action as well. So fantastic. And 10 minutes for questions. Amazing. I want to really open it up to anybody who has questions, and we have quite a bit of folks on here. And please take this opportunity to ask some questions here. Anybody? And I see your camera. Pick on you.
Taking a pause just to see if anyone else wanted to ask, but I guess and I thank you also, Zay. I heard you speak recently at our Hellman kickoff for change makers. So, and is so inspired and also thought provoking as always. And I guess one thing that came to mind for me is changing systems and is so challenging sometimes, and you alluded to it with your classic smile and positive attitude, but frustrating and even though I know I keep thinking about some of the like justice warriors we met in the South with Glide and how they talked about how, I don't know, resilient they were in the face of everything, of the change that they were striving for, and how long change takes. So I guess I'm just wondering on a personal level, how do you keep chipping away when there's so many barriers that come up, like institutional barriers? We talked recently about just trying to remunerate our family accountability board that I've helped launch, and just like all systems in UCSF and even in the federal tax system or the state tax system, and trying to do that, all the barriers we face. And so just wondering what your reflections are on that.
Well, I guess I want to start by validating that it is so hard and sometimes so demoralizing. So yes, it is. I think that, well, I guess the easy answer is this, like, yes, this work is frustrating, but what's the alternative? Like, I think sitting in a system that creates so much harm for so many kids of color would be intolerable for me, at least. And so I think that as a result, I don't know what else to do. But that being said, and I mentioned this at the Hellman thing too, I think it's really important to kind of recognize that it doesn't have to all be you. And one of my family members, she used to remind me all the time, now she doesn't have to anymore, but she would go, are you Jesus? Can you walk on water? To which, of course, I would have to be like, no. And then she would be like, then why do you think that you have to do it all? Why are you trying to save the world? And so I think for me, Anda, I try to be, and this sounds ridiculous because I don't do it very well, but I try to be focused on just a handful of things that I'm trying to move, recognizing that there's going to be a bunch of other things that somebody else is going to have to move. And then I also try to think about, if I work really hard to move something, how can I move it in such a way that it will never go back, so that I don't feel like I'm running in sand? And that work takes a little bit longer, but it's more satisfying, because what I know is that in order for me to retire someday, I need to know that the stuff that I did is not going to snap back the second that I don't have eyes on it. And so I'm constantly trying to think about like little p policy, which, although it can seem insurmountable, is created by a bunch of human beings that don't get elected. And so, like, how can we be making changes in the institution at the little p level that can be sustained? And then how do you celebrate your small victories? Because it's really easy to be caught up in all of the things that you didn't achieve, all of the problems that didn't work out. And so how do we celebrate? And so Hellman Foundation, I really am grateful to them, because, we launched the Abundant Birth Project basically right when the pandemic launched. And, it just was like fast running. And we finished this thing that was actually quite a feat. And it was so difficult. And trying to get the California-wide one has been even more difficult. And so it was hard to recognize, like, there was a win in that somewhere, And so Hellman, gave us a little bit of money, and we took the entire research and implementation team out to eat. And most of us hadn't even seen each other all together in real life for like years. And just to take that little pause and recognize, like, hey, we did this thing, I think gave us the energy to go through the things that we are going through now to get the California-wide one up. So but it's hard also. It sucks. If it were easy, probably someone would have done it already.
Very true. Thanks so much, Zaya.
Thank you, Anda.
There are other folks who have questions?
All right, should we let people have 4 minutes of self-care?
I think so. There are people on, so everyone's waiting for a question to hear you speak, but I don't see any questions. Well, Zia, thank you so much. This is really fantastic work and truly inspiring. And I hope that some of us get to interact with you and learn from you, and maybe even take some of your lessons and work on our little P's in our little 6M family.
Yay, I love that. So thank you guys so much for hearing me rant for all of this time, and I hope that I get to see you all soon too.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much.